Thank you for coming. I made little packets of information. They're on the table. Sorry, I forgot to tell you about that. They're just some handouts that we use in our courses, just general reference, and we'll talk about a few of the things on them today. But we're in the growing season now, and we're getting into the planting season for the summer crops. And one of the things that changed my life was when I was trying to heal the soil was realizing that healing the soil, especially if you're coming into a new site, takes time, and sometimes the plants, they're not getting what they need from the soil microbes and the mineralization and the energy, and prayer is really important and intention with them, and sometimes they're still needing more nutrient, and they won't usually wait their life, especially if they're annual plants. There's not a lot of tolerance for a lot of time without the critical nutrient before they start to really suffer or affect their yield. So one of the things that we're going to cover today is how to identify where you are in your growing system, what your most bang for your buck actions might be. It might be a cover crop. It might be, different soil, different environments. You may have no cover on your soil, and if your soil's bare, that might be your first thing that you focus on. But in addition to that, I want to go a little more in depth about if you're in the growing season and you're trying to grow plants, going into the yield determining windows of your plants. And so some of these I just taught a 3-day workshop a week ago. So some of these I already kind of drew out a little bit. And one of the things I'll start out with the fundamentals is, you guys probably, some of you heard Dan Kittredge speak, some of you may know about soil biology, chemistry, physics. Basically, Jessica and I really connected, and Dan Kittredge and I, because we're interconnecting the spiritual, the physical, the mineral, the biological, and understanding that these are actually all one. And some people have presented, chemistry, physics, biology. I can't write while I'm talking. Biology, supposed to say biology there. And I always said it's a 4-legged stool with the spiritual in our thoughts, because of the research. It's really coming into the scientific world to be recognized that our thoughts and our energy of our body affects everything around us, that we're one with it. And everything that the spiritual traditions were teaching for years, science is now proving to be true, and science and religion are coming closer. So I oftentimes had used the analogy of the stool, or we're very useful for us as making the connections between them, because I realized that they're actually all the same house. Like when you're looking at a sick plant, if I pull a biology test, it's going to be sick. If I pull a leaf chemistry or soil chemistry, it's going to be out of balance. And if I take my penetrometer out there, it's likely compacted, or there's some other physical issue affecting the plant, either too much or too little water, or no cover. So, and again, different people have different spiritual beliefs, but for me, everything is spiritual, so all of these are spirit. So, I like to think of it as we're looking through different windows into the same house. And so then if you're like, well, they're all related and they're all connected, how do you know what to do first, right? Because you're there, what do I do first? There's all these million choices of things you could do, from compost to fertilizer, mineralization to biology to, cover crops, and you're just like, where do I start? One of the things I like to point people to is one of your documents, and the handout is called What Are Nature's Principles? And there's a lot of different groups who have coined and observed deep observation of nature. They've come up with principles, and I just call them nature's principles because they all came from nature, whether they're permaculture principles or holistic managed principles or the NRCS soil health principles. And that's where the Bionutrient Food Association and I really, really are complementary, in that we're not trying to, be in any label or any box. We're really about getting beyond the labels and getting down to the practices. So if you look at the second page of your Nature's Principles, there's the NRCS soil principles, and there are 4 of them. Ray Archuleta now teaches 8 or 11 of them, but those 4 are a really great place to start, in that if you don't have this, it's keep the soil covered and minimize disturbance and maximize diversity and energize with living roots. And so a lot of times when I begin with someone, if they're having problems, or even on my own farm, I try to look at, it should be like, it's down on the bottom of the second page. So if you look at those 4 things, and any of those pieces are missing, like pretty much you want a living, growing root 24/7. Why? Because the plant needs the sunlight to produce the sugars to feed the microbes. Now, if you have some type of sheet mulching, that can help to feed the microbes, but the living roots really help, and they feed kind of different sources of carbon and different sugars. So if any of those 4 are missing, I would say probably what you're doing is not going to be as effective if you don't have all 4 of them present. And if you don't have the soil covered, that would be my number one thing. If it's Dan Kittredge used the analogy of like your mother sitting there naked, right, and starving in the street. Like, would you leave her naked and starving? No, you would cover her and give her food. And same thing with our Mother Earth. So basically, there's one of your other documents is a chart of disturbances, and they're not all sorts of disturbances. But if you look in your handouts, there's a page with a lot of boxes on it. One of them are harmful disturbances, which are always harmful, and the other ones, you want to avoid those, and the other ones are potentially harmful, and so if you need to use them rarely or with mindfulness that you are really disturbing the system. And then there's positive disturbances, because some of the things we do, even if we put on microbes or we put down minerals, the system has to accommodate that. And so when I've done a lot of testing, you see the whole thing going into swing. It's just like your body. Anything you do is going to cause this, adaptation. Everything's changing, dynamic. We're really resilient beings, and so the soil is like that. It's alive. And so look at the disturbances chart, and first I like to say identify any adverse factors, which is anything that's harming you, actively harming you, especially if you're spending money on it and time, because if you can stop doing it, then you can save money, time, and not be harming your system. And a lot of systems, a lot of agricultural systems, are stuck relying on things that are adverse factors that actually harm the system. So my family farms were, addicted to chemicals to control their weed issue because they weren't using cover crops. And so nature's trying to cover the soil, and the weeds are one of the few things that will grow in the compacted land, that they were dealing with. And the more herbicides they put, the more the salts dried out the soil, and the more it compacted, and the more weeds it grew, and the more chemical. It was just so we learned how to fix that. And sometimes you have to stop, but if you stop and you're relying on your production, you have to be mindful that you don't want to just lose your crop. If you have a lot of value or a lot of acres, or your economic, making a payment to the bank or something depends on that, you're going to have to bring the system up at the same time of bringing some of the disturbances down. And that is where the delicate balance goes of how to make this transition, whether it's your body healing. I've done it all ways, going cold turkey and just throwing the good stuff at it, or doing it over time. And it's really an individual answer. I can't say how to do it. But basically, I'm encouraging people to look at the real cost of some of these things, because a lot of people don't charge for their time. And you guys are more organic group, or biological group especially. So it's not like, do any of you guys use herbicides? Probably none of you guys, right? Would even think of it. So, but a lot of us do till. A lot of organic farmers till, or they use copper sulfates or organic fungicides, things that are still harmful. We want to look at, and I'll teach you about something today that are like discriminatory fungal control. So something that works on pathogens that doesn't harm your good fungi, so that you're not stuck in that rut of tilling for weeds or putting out an organic fungicide for the fungal disease. And again, you have to look at your cost, because if you have a high value fruit crop and you're going to lose all your trees, you've invested 15 years into a fungal disease, well, don't lose your trees. But then how do you come back in and fix the soil? And then how do you help the tree in the short run? And so these foliar feeds are a big part of that. And so then there's things called log jams, which are not necessarily adverse. They're not necessarily harming the system so much, but they're places where the system, nature's trying to give us abundance, and it's like a road, it's a narrowing where we're limiting by either doing something or not doing something that's getting in nature's way of giving us bounty. So this is like holding back your potential. So lack of soil cover, it is a harm, but it's also like holding you back. So so this may be in either one, but it's not necessarily important that you know the difference between a log jam or an adverse factor, and some things are gray areas. But just think about, there's things that harm and there's things that are just you're not doing or are doing that are kind of holding the whole thing back a little bit, like holding the reins too tight. And so we want to look at what's the minimal amount of human intervention that we can do, because nature, plants, microbes, sunlight, these things they know way more than we do about how to be healthy. And but there's times, and most of our soil is disturbed. We've disturbed it, and so I believe that I'm dedicated my whole life to actually learning how maybe I could possibly be of service or help to the situation and remediate things a little faster than nature would do over many, many, many years. So I've found that in a few years, or even a few months sometimes, the soil can become totally different if I do the right things and stop doing the wrong things. So then we're going to really focus in today on is feeding the plants. So again, you always have to keep in the back of your mind your costs and your system, which I can't go into individually too much, but is it worth it now? Or do I want to let these plants kind of struggle along, still photosynthesize a little, and really start working on the soil for the next generation of plants? So that's why I love cover crops, because, and we're going to talk about this, but we have a little place here that was just grass and we covered with cardboard, and this cover crop is like a canary in the coal mine. It's telling me how the soil is going to be. Is it ready for my cash crops, or my more, time consuming crops? So, and can you get it done? So it may be worth it, but you just can't get it done because of time. So you just have to look at it. Even if you know how, even if I show you, you may not be able to incorporate that right now. But over time, the way I'm going to show you is really easy. It's just mixing some things with water, and it could be a bucket, or there's little things that screw on your garden hose, or mist bottle. So I'm trying to show you the easiest ways to kind of help the plants. And then basically, if you're having to do this and this, you're going to definitely have to look at the soil and the long-term soil building, so that you can then step out of the way. Maybe the next growing season you don't have to irrigate, or you don't have to feed the plants or any of that stuff. So and that's where I don't have it on this one, but in the landscape design afterwards, if anybody wants to stay, we're doing some things to mimic what trees and nature does as far as changing the soil on our property with incorporating berms and swales, slowing the water down, because basically man came in with herbicide and cropped all this and removed the forest, and then it was creating eroding valleys and eroding the spring heads, we've got 30 foot of erosion coming off of all sides of this kind of high plain, and we've got trees growing in it. So I know the erosion happened in the 1800s or early 1900s because of the age of the trees that are growing in the gullies. But when the land was cleared at some point, this happened. And so we're trying to do things with the water movement to actually, and then planting trees that then will infiltrate that water and slow it down and spread it out and take it from the valley in a narrow channel and take it on a ditch on contour, so it spreads it out and then overflows in a big, long, wide sheet. And it's very passive, so we pacify the water by making it level. So, and then we release it on these level spills, so that even if it's downpouring, like the other day we got a downpour, so much water was collected that would have just run off with our nutrient, and we live right on the James River. I mean, you saw it yesterday. It's just chalky, milky, nasty, so there's things that we can do for the long term with water and vegetation changes that really will, even if we stepped away and did nothing more, pretty much 80 to 90% fix some of these problems on their own. And then later, even though they look like ditches now, they'll fill in the tree roots. By that time, the trees will be bigger, and those roots will be taking the infiltration that the swale was originally designed to do. So, it's a long-term thing. And so in your garden, this may be just trying to build perennial pathways and perennial edges, and really helping the soil in the long term with your mulching and things like that. And so feeding the plants. So we want to feed plants when the biology isn't doing it yet. and we want to look at why is the biology not doing it yet, but we're pretty much going to talk. I thought one practical tool will be talking about foliar feeding. And so this is a concept that was presented to me, and it changed my life because I had never heard this before. And it's becoming very more mainstream now. But when it was first presented to me, it was like, wow, I never knew that. As many classes as I'd been to on soil and fertilizer and things. So you have a seed, and the seed germinates, starts growing a leaf and a root, and then it gets its first true leaf, second true leaf, third true leaf, all these different vegetative states, and it's putting on more and more leaves. And then it's at some point starting to bud, and then the buds either elongate out, or there's like a stem elongation, and then they basically go in, so it's bud, and then the grass goes into a boot, what we call a boot stage, where the flower is still in the sheath and it hasn't elongated out, and we can see some of that in the field if any of you walk out. And then there's flowering, and we can see that also, the rye is flowering, the wind's been blowing a lot of the flowers off, but and that's when pollination is happening in a lot of plants right now. And then basically your seed pods begin, and the seed starts filling with nutrient. And so basically there's always, from the sun coming down and the plant pushing exudates out, carbon and liquid sugars out for the microbes, there's this downward, but there's also upward, whereas the plant's taking in nutrient by sending out water out of its leaves, and it's sucking in nutrient. And then when it starts forming seeds, a lot of the nutrients accumulated in its life, especially an annual plant, will put into its seed. So at that point, it's translocating minerals, it's just moving them around, but it's not a time when it's really uptaking a lot of minerals. Like for an annual plant, like a soybean or a corn or a tomato or any of these plants a lot of us grow in our gardens, it's really over at a certain point of how that plant has set its yield. And so what I didn't know is that corn is setting its yield in the first 2 weeks of its after germination. And that's only one of it has 3 yield determining windows. So if you think about it, it's great that she brought the corn, because it has how many ears on each plant, right? How many of those ears are on each plant? So a plant that's struggling for nutrient might make 1 ear, and that's all the nutrient it has. And so early in its life, it's not actually needing a lot of that nutrient because it's very small. It doesn't need a lot of, if you think of the minerals as like beams in your house, your major minerals being your big structural beams, and your trace minerals being more like the little fasteners and things and the enzymes that make, they plug into enzymes that makes all the enzymes go. They don't need a lot of them, but they're very important. They're actually some of the most important ones are the trace minerals. It doesn't need a lot because it's not building a big structure yet, but it's sensing the soil, and it has an intelligence, and it's setting its yield potential as early as this. And then, so you can fertilize after that through the foliage.
Is there a certain day, like day 7 or something?
I think it's more related to the vegetative state. I have a chart, and it goes through, there's all these different vegetative V1, V2, V3, all these vegetative states, and it lists like, of course, corn has been really researched because it's one of our main commercial crops. Soybeans also. I have those charts of like exactly which minerals it's needing at which times, but basically if you fertilize after that, you will not get more ears per plant. Now, if you fertilize after that, corn has 2 other yield determinants. If you think about it, there's not only how many ears per plant, but how many kernels long and how many rows around, and also how dense is each kernel. How we saw a variation in the corn here today. Some of the kernels were more shrivelly, some were more full. And so the more mineralized the plant is, the heavier test weight, the more nutrient dense it is, and that's what we're all here today to talk about, is getting nutrition in the food, nutrition in the soil, so the soil can do its functions of sequestering carbon, filtering our water, providing us food, all these things. So it's really about getting these minerals and energy cycling, the energy from the sun into the leaves, into the roots, into the seed, and then through our bodies. And so later, pretty much all the way through early reproductive in corn, you can still affect yield, but you just can't affect how many ears per plant. Now, again, everything we know in science is always changing. We are just beginning to learn. So this, very soon, it could be wrong, right? What we think we know about corn. And most of the time when we think we know something, we're mistaken. But it's more important to get the principle of it than the specifics. And as the specifics, as people that are really focusing on these issues study them, you can learn the specifics. But the principles are kind of like an anchor. And I'm learning how this works in perennial plants, because a lot of what we're going for on this farm is more perennial systems. We're not having to disturb them every year, more perennial food guarding. I have resources and I've taken courses on perennial forest gardening, perennial vegetable gardening. If you guys are interested, I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to learn and do it. And so obviously a perennial keeps its root alive, and then its yield yearly, annually. Like right now, the apple trees, their buds are forming for next year's fruit. So it's like when Dan was here and I was like, well, should I treat them? And he was like, yes, because right now they're forming their buds for next year's fruit. So they have a little different cycle, whereas one year may affect the next year. The other thing I can say is, and Dan Kittredge talked about this nicely, and even commercial cattle magazines are talking about this, is that the health of a mother, a young woman who's having a child, or a cow, young female cow who's having a first child, or a plant, the yield, several generations are affected by the health of the mother. So if we're looking at a degraded system, it could be up to 3 generations or maybe more before we're really even beginning to explore what the potential could be. So I think the interesting thing is that what we think of as a yield potential, we don't know. From my experience, Mother Nature has been more abundant than any scientist has ever dreamed of, and in the systems of whether it's the cattle or the tree crops or whatever it is, the people that are doing the work and at the forefront, every time they think they've hit the max, some other layer comes open to them, and it's just like your spiritual practice. When you think you've hit, it's like peeling an onion. There's layers of this abundance, and so we don't really know what our plants could yield. But if you look, I've looked back into the records in these counties of like in the 30s, 40s. There was a lot of amazing research, and a lot of these counties produced more quantity and more varieties of food than they do now because of the chemicals. So I think that if we look at yields back then, it would be more, even at least further, we can do that at least, or better, I believe. So really, some of your first yield determination, I don't know every plant, is somewhere in the early stages. And so that's why we use seed inoculant powders, because we coat that seed with microbes and minerals and an enzyme chelator activator, so that as it's growing out, it's coated in the right microbes and it's sensing. It doesn't need a lot of soluble nutrient, and we don't actually want a lot of soluble nutrient in our soil, because when it rains, it's going to go with the water. But we want the microbes replenishing. It's like having a gas tank that someone's always filling versus having a big gas tank that you're storing all this tank, and then it's really vulnerable to being lost or damaged. Like if you stored all your fuel for a year in a tank on your farm, what if there was an earthquake? What if there was a flood? What if there was, it's vulnerable. And if it's soluble, it's not on this chart, but I can draw, do you guys understand soluble nutrient? Like that it's soluble in water, and do you know how it's like a pyramid where the soluble is the tip of the iceberg, and it's the microbes that take the nutrient that's locked on the sand, silt, and clay and put it into soluble at the demand of the plant. And the plants are turning on or off different sugars to feed different microbes at different times so that they can get different nutrients. And so it's a very complex system, but in the end, there's no waste. And most human systems, there's a ton of waste, and the inputs, nature designs these systems so there's no waste, and the inputs are always provided. So again, because we've disturbed the soil, and then when we build houses and build things, a lot of times the soil is disturbed and has been. And so that's why we want to talk about feeding the plants, because if we're trying to grow food and we don't have our microbial plant communication system all rebuilt and all those networks of fungal hypha in the soil all non-disturbed, that's like the information highway is the fungal hypha and the fungal networks. Plants communicate with other plants, they send nutrient to other plants. There's all this communication going on in the soil that if we keep disturbing it through tillage, we'll never rebuild, and so we'll be stuck feeding the plants. But if we can figure out ways to disturb minimally, which we're going to show you a few today if you haven't seen them, that really help, at least be able to get your crops in and help with weeds and help build this soil. So let's see. So basically, if you take a soil test and your soil says that it's low in sulfur, low in magnesium, low in boron, or low in potassium, or whatever is low, something that's low is a lot easier for nature to deal with than something that's in excess. Nature has ways of dealing with those excesses, and a lot of times it's our weeds. A lot of the weeds will rebalance the soil mineral profile. So if something's in excess, a certain plant will grow that can uptake it and kind of keep it from being toxic and inhibiting, because if one thing is in excess, it can actually inhibit the uptake of something else. So even if you have it in your soil, it might not be bioavailable because it's being bound electromagnetically to this other thing that's in excess, so it's basically unavailable. So excesses are harder than deficiencies, and but deficiencies, a lot of times nature has a way around, but there are some that are very limiting. I had a drawing of the enzyme, but basically enzymes make all things run, and Dan Kittredge said it great. It's like if you get a hoop house, greenhouse kit, and you have all the screws and you have all the stuff laid out, and you want to put it together, but you don't have the right screwdriver or the right wrench. How are you going to put that together? You can have all these minerals, but if you're missing the one, each enzyme, and I'm not a biochemist, but I just think of them like Pac-Man, or like, maybe they have like a key, like, a shape. They all have a unique shape of, and when the trace mineral comes and clicks in, it makes everything go, whether it's all your hormonal reactions are covered by enzymes. So all growth, reproductions, all functions of the body are basically regulated by enzymes. And so if you are missing a trace mineral, you might have all the calcium phos you need, but it might not be able to utilize and put together to make structure on the plant, if that makes sense. So that's why for many years they didn't focus on the trace minerals, because they were needed in very small amounts. So it was like, well, they're needed in tiny amounts. Like, what's a little boron, or what's there's even arsenic needed to make our nerves run. Like, that's a poison. Too much, not good. Too little, really not good. So nature works in the Goldilocks principle of kind of there's a middle way. It's too much or too low. It's too wet or too cold. Too wet or too dry, too hot or too cold. And this really applies, and I think very deeply about this and observe, because if you think about your farm, and let's say you put compost on or lime or whatever you did, and it helped. So let's just think about health as like a highway, and even when you're on a highway, you're always steering a little bit, even if you're going straight, right? You're just kind of, and that's where I would like to be as a manager of the system, is like I would like to just make little adjustments early on, rather than some big thing that's going to have to be adjusted for. And, we don't always get there. But if your system is like coming off the road on the left and you put lime or compost, you get a little poured back the center. Well, maybe you got a positive plant response. Your plants look better. Well, the next year or the next planting, you're like, oh, that works so well, I'm going to do it again. It works so well, I'm going to do it again. And I'm going to do it again. And pretty soon you're off in the ditch on the right. So I think about, just because something is good for my system, the system is never the same. From hour to hour, from minute to minute, it's never the same. And so we get stuck in, sometimes as humans, we like patterns and we like routines and we like, a list, a checklist.
Sameness.
Yes. And so a lot of times I find that limits, that's one of those log jams. It's not necessarily harmful. It can be. Or it can just be somewhat holding us back. A great example I'll use from the grazing is a lot of people do rotational grazing and they just move the animals through. They have their paddocks. They're the same shape. And they're like, I always graze this one in April, and then I go to my summer pasture, and then I go and I feed hay over here. And if you think about that patterning, even of how you walk around your farm, it affects the soil. And so if you want diversity, which is one of our principles, and the pasture and a perennial system, and in nature, the animals are moving, like something happens, they all run over here. They're never exactly moving in the same pattern. And so what we've tried to do on the farm, there are no working fences. We've tried to fence in big areas, and then we use these flexible fences to make all sorts of shapes so that, and we try to graze the field at different times a year. So we don't want to always graze this field if birds are nesting in it, or, I mean, cows and birds have existed a long time. I actually seen the birds coming back more with the cattle than they ever did before. But think about, okay, well, if we're grazing this in the early spring, then what we're tromping down is really juicy green tender stuff, right? In early spring, everything's really juicy tender green, and then in the summer it's more brown and stalky and stemmy because the plants have gone to seed. And so the stemmy stalky stuff is a different food for the soil than the green juicy stuff. And so every plant has a place in biological succession that it does better. And I don't want to go too much into this, but some plants like more fungal environments, like the woods and trees are more fungal, and then your brassicas, your mustard greens, your early successional plants that would come in, your brassicas are more bacterial dominated. And so if we stomp down with the cows, or we put down a cover crop that's more green versus brown, we're feeding a different group of microbes, and we're selecting, or if we till it in versus if we leave it on the surface. Because a plant in nature, if you think about it, plants grow and then they seed out and they bow down to the ground and they release their bounty, and basically all their leaves die, and then the snow comes or rain and packs it down, and then it's basically on the top. Well, a fungus, it looks under the microscope like this. I'm not the best artist, but these are the enzymes at the growing tip. These are the cells and all the nucleus, and it can move this around, and it digests things. And so it can go up to the soil surface if it's left undisturbed and digest, and then it can translocate that nutrient large distances to plants, multiple plants. Mycorrhizal fungus and stuff can do that. And then your bacteria are tiny, like they're not, traveling an inch for them is more than you would travel in a lifetime, and they have to swim. All these organisms kind of live in the water in our soil. So if we, coming back to the principles, if we let our soil dry out, then they're not going to survive. And if we till something in, then we put it, whether it's with our chickens or with a tiller, or we put it into smaller pieces, the bacteria, it's more of a bacterial food. So if it's greener, if it's younger, less woody, it's more of bacterial food. If it's smaller pieces and put more into the soil, it's more bacterial food. And if it's more on the surface, more woody, it's going to kind of select for more fungi. And so sometimes in your garden, you may not want it to get too fungal dominated, or at least you want to at least have a good amount of active bacteria, because the plants are always modulating this. So basically, if you feed the soil, it's related to the composition. So carbon to nitrogen ratio, if you want to get technical, or I say like softness, green, anything you can crunch with your hands that doesn't sound crunchy is more of a bacterial food. And the younger it is, the more tender it is, the more of a bacterial food, because the higher nitrogen to carbon ratio. Anything more like brown leaves, brown twigs. Now there's variances in that. Coffee grounds are brown, but they're a bacterial food. And if you have a nitrogen tree that you have mulch from, it's a little more bacterial, a little more higher nitrogen, but it's still woody. The positioning in the soil profile, so we went over this, soil surface is a fungal food, punched in or tilled in is a bacterial food, and the size of the particle. So, and it's all regulated by moisture, temperature, the barometric pressure, the moon. The moon controls the tides. Same thing happens in the soil. Like every day, the water's coming up and coming down and coming up and coming down in the soil, in our bodies. And so nothing can grow without the water. And so we want to, I think it was on the other chart, but basically each plant will have a different place in fungal to bacterial ratio that it likes. Now, our job, again, is to get out of the way. We're not here to micromanage the soil. And so what I found, like when I've been observed real working systems, a lot of times you can have a good diversity in there, and the plant will make it. You can see a tomato, here it is, growing really well in the same, using the same soil and compost as a brassica. Now, if this is bare soil or bare rock, and then a bird poops on it, it becomes moss. If you're in hiking in the woods and you see rocks, and then they have like moss and little tiny grasses, and then over time, the wind collects more organic matter and things. That's more fungal food, more leaves blow on it, and then it builds up. And so like pasture, and then you get to bushes and vines. And this is in a humid climate. Now, if you're in an arid environment in a desert, it's completely different, right? You don't get bushes and vines coming in the desert because you don't have the moisture. So there's a different kind of succession going on, and we can talk about that if anybody's interested. But for now, in this climate in Virginia, nature will push it more fungal because the more that grows above, the more falls down on the surface. Think about how many leaves a tree drops versus a grass plant. There's way more fungal food from the trees, yet we chop them up and remove them. And this is nature's way of feeding itself all winter, keeping those fungi alive so in the spring when it needs nutrient, it's ready to go. So basically you can find whatever plants you want to grow. Like if you had strawberries you mentioned today, they actually grow in a mature oak forest. They're native, they're not out in the sun usually in nature. So even though they're very small, so in general the smaller the plant, the more bacterial dominated. When you think about some of these understory plants, they're actually really, really fungal. So a strawberry, a woods might be 1,000 to 1 fungi when pasture's 1 to 1, or your annual veggies may be 1 to 1, or 2 to 1. You know, the grapes might be more like 2 to 1 or 5 to 1. And your brassicas are slightly bacterially dominated. They might be slightly less than 1. But the goal is, and the more I've learned, we're also learning about this, is that whatever you have in the soil, the plant will wake up and change the ratio based on its sugars, based on what it needs. And it will change it in what's called the rhizosphere, which is like a micrometer or nanometer, little tiny area around the root. So that's why you can see moss growing under berries. Who's ever seen that? Like moss growing under, out in nature, you walk through a field, you see like moss under the berries. Well, moss is very bacterial and a blackberry is very viney, so what's going on there? And it's microclimates. It's not like the soil is a homogeneous unit, you know, and so we have to think about that with our soil testing. And so, you know, basically while this plant and what we're putting down is regulating who's living, it's kind of like there's white wolves and dark wolves, and maybe they symbolize good and evil. An ancient, you know, which one survives? The one you feed. So it's very deep saying it's applicable to the soil. Well, whatever foods the plant is putting out or whatever foods we're putting down on the surface, it's going to create this environment. Same things with our thoughts. If we focus on our problem and we focus on what we don't want, we're basically taking this whole complex thing that the problem's related to, and we're focusing on this problem, my weeds, or whatever the problem is. If we turn around and we look at what we want to create, that's a whole different view. Right? Do you drive looking at all the things you don't want to hit? You look at the trees while you're driving? I mean, I do sometimes, but you know, you try not to hit them. So we don't drive that way. We don't walk that way, you know. And if any of you ride horses, there's this famous saying, wherever you look, you're going to end up. Like on a horse, if you're looking down, you end up on the ground. So you don't want to end up there. You got to look where you want to go. So same thing in our system. So we really want to focus on what we want to create and have a clear picture. Like when you're inoculating those seeds, or put them in your mouth, or hold them next to you, and just have a clear picture of what you want to create, and a feeling like of how it's going to feel when you and that plant are able to, you know, when that plant is growing. And basically they've proven that the plants will change their bodies if we go and sit and meditate or just lie down in the garden for 20 minutes a day. The plants actually change physiologically to match what we need.
Would you say something more about putting the seeds in your mouth? I just heard that recently, and
I read it, and I don't have any
Anastasia?
scientific literature.
I think a woman channeled it from Russia. And
Anastasia.
Yeah.
The Ringing Cedars series.
But old timers around here even did that.
It's just intuitive.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
And there's enzymes in our saliva too.
To help wake them. Yeah.
But also there's a communication. You know, I was just filming the cows this morning when I turned them out, and these cows can like walk across land, and they sense this plant isn't just right. They sense it faster than we can, and they can pick exactly which leaf they want. It's not accidental, and they'll go through the whole paddock and pick the first leaves. And then they turn around. If they get to the end, they're like, oh. They turn around, they go back, and they pick the second choice leaves. Like, I've got it on film this morning with, okay, this cow is now eating the second choice leaves when it was just picked the middle of the plant, the highest energy part of the plant, the highest energy plants in the paddock. Now, if we turned them loose on the whole farm, they would really show us where the energy is, and the palatable energy. Because I was working with a guy named Dave Jackie last week here, and he was showing me a chart. I was more interested in energy because a lot of times we have excess protein and we don't have enough energy, like fats and sugars. And so in grazing systems or in systems, like our chickens are always looking for energy. They have enough green stuff, they have enough protein. And so he was showing me a chart of 700 studies of these different woody species like maples and things, and what the energy content of leaves. But yet the cows won't eat. Juniper was like one of the highest energy, but it has these aromatic oils or tannins, or the plants develop defense mechanisms, the highest energy ones, against digestibility. Like nuts, they have an anti-digestibility, and that's why we soak the nuts, or beans, so it's really complex, and humans tend to want to focus on one thing. But the best thing to do is just foster diversity and get out of the way. And then if it's not working, we can figure out some foliar feeding. So I wanted to just share with you that I've done a little bit about this. I don't have funded research to test all the time, and I don't have time to test everything that I would like to. But a lot of times I will pull, and I have some examples of this on my computer or print it out if you want to see. I will pull a foliar, a test of the leaves, or even now they're doing the sap, which is even more current, because it's easy and it's inexpensive, and you can go, like, if something doesn't look right on your plant. I just did this in my pastures, and I've done it every year because I'm trying to see how my soil program is going. But I just pick, and again, they want to know what leaf stage was it in. Like, if you see something germinating and the seedling looks a little purple around the edge, or looks a little red, or looks like it's not quite right, you can start to figure out pretty immediately what the plant needs. And then we can mix it in a foliar spray and there's an agent that I'm going to tell you about that is a chelator, so it takes away any of the salt or acid, because a lot of the minerals we use are salts and acids. So even if it's naturally mined, if we're putting it out on the soil, nature takes time to digest it. But through the leaf, think about a leaf, it has certain openings called stomata, little holes, you guys know that? And so they're a certain size, and we need to have the molecules in a certain size stick to the leaf and be able to go through the leaf. And so we also need to make sure that it's not going to burn the plant. So if we put too much salt on your body, it would burn, or might pull water out of you. Or if we put acid on your skin, right, it wouldn't be good for you. But what if, and so chelation, is where we take the minerals and we put them with in an organic form. And I'm not a biochemist, so I cannot tell you the formulas and what's going on the molecular level, but I can say it reduces the biotoxic effects to your plants and your microbes, because these salts, the herbicides, most of their there's a lot of detriment, but most of their detriment in the soil and in our guts is that they're heavy salts, and they have a huge electronic pull, and they bind the trace minerals to them, and then the microbes can't grow right, and we are malnourished, or the animals, like a lot of the dogs are finding in cats because of all the corn and soy that has grown with Roundup. It's basically they're malnourished. Even though the food is fortified with these vitamins and minerals, they're binding to the Roundup in our guts, and in the animals' guts. And so there's some of these salt and acid things. That's why they say, and Dan said, the best thing to do is put your mineral and your lime in your compost pile and then compost it, because it's then going to be put into the biological system in a form, it's like a language that the biology can speak, and you'll use less of it. Or mix it with manure and straw, and that's an organic chelation. If you have like actual mineral dust that you're putting down, you can mix it into your compost pile, and that's going to be better than just putting it directly on the soil. And then in a liquid form, we have a fermented product that's made from fermented plants that's stabilized, and it basically feeds microbes. And it also, a lot of times when you put out any kind of fertilizer, even if it's natural, the soil itself has positive and negative charges. And so they've found that even a fertilizer will often, about 80% of it, different ratios for different things, will actually tie up. So 80% of it is just not even available, and whatever you put on the soil, you got to think about 4 or 6 weeks, really, unless it's a soluble nutrient, like if you're buying a soluble nitrogen or a soluble thing, if you're putting rocks out, basically, it's going to take them 4 or 6 weeks to get kind of into the microbes, into the mineral cycle, into your plants, and it's going to help the soil in the long run. And sometimes it can help a little in the short run, but what we want if we're doing a foliar feed is stuff that's like an IV. We're basically, it's like an IV. You're like, okay, come in with some electrolytes because the plant is missing this. And so the plant has to have the minerals in its tissues in order to make those yield determining windows. And now they've kind of studied enough plants, like all your apples and fruits and vegetables, like pretty much the labs have identified these ranges of which the tissues should have at a certain stage this much nitrogen, this much phosphorus, this much boron, this much magnesium for it to make a good yield. Now, I'm not saying their ranges are perfect, but they do have ranges. And so for about, I think it's like $16 or $12, you can take a little bit of that plant and send it to a lab in Richmond called A&L, and they can give you a test, a colored graph that shows you you're too high in this, you're too low in this. And if you oftentimes, you can pair it with a soil sample, it will be slightly different than the soil right under the plant. Like even if you take the sample right in the root zone of that plant, it's like, why is that? Well, what's in the soil test, they're using different acids to extract more than what's soluble. Now there are some labs that just do total water soluble tests. Like I think Haney does some, and there's other soil tests that are just testing what's soluble. But other than that, this is what I was kind of referring to earlier. You have these mineral pools, and so in the soil, your soluble mineral is like the tip of the iceberg. And it's what's, I may have spelled soluble wrong, not a great speller. But then you have your exchangeable, and it's like, I'm at the market, I got all my veggies, they're ready to sell, but you gotta give me some money for it. They're one step away from being plant food. So soluble is plant nutrient. But it can wash away with water because it's completely soluble in water. It means it's water soluble is what it means. It's in water. And this is why our Chesapeake Bay and our rivers are having so much problem, because there's too much soluble nutrient going into the water because of all the fertilizers that are being put out that are soluble or making things soluble in the wrong forms. And then the farms that have lost their cover and not cover cropped and tilled, they're just making the soil wash and erosion and all sorts of things. So this is, you ideally want this small. And they're identifying, a lot of labs still go on an acid extraction, which is testing more into things that the plant can't use yet. And they're predicting that that will be made available by biology or whatever means. But ideally you want the small. And then the exchangeable is like what's on the outsides of the soil particles, kind of what's ready to be exchanged by a microbe, an enzyme, like and again, they're enzymes. To digest this, they need the trace minerals, right? So if your trace minerals lacking, your microbial growth will be harmed, and your plant growth will be harmed. So I used to put out microbes on the soil and watch them die, and if you're putting out a bunch of microbes but their enzymes can't work and they can't feed themselves or the plants because this trace mineral is lacking, that's why minerals and microbes equal magic. So in any, whether it's your gut or whether it's any natural system that I've seen, like minerals, microbes, and I say enzymes or activators, like those together are what's needed. So just putting minerals on the soil may not, immediately work. It does help a lot. You've got to do things like cover crops and things so your microbes aren't destroyed, right? If you're just adding minerals but you're still tilling and leaving it bare over the winter, it's not really going to be that effective. But if you're doing things that support the microbes eating the minerals and then them surviving, and you're adding a little bit of mineral for them, then that's better. So this is like on the outside, it's like ready to be exchanged. Or digested. And we can go into all sorts of things about that on another day, but basically then this is like your extractable. several steps away. This is like, yeah, I could sell you plants, but I'd have to plant them and grow them and then bring them to market. Like, it's not even ready to be exchanged. It's potential. This is related to the soil potential. And then the total extractable is your total. And this is like if you did what's called a total, the test that would test everything would be a total grind and combustion, which most labs don't do. But what people found was that most soils, when they say our soils are selenium deficient or this deficient, like a lot of times they're deficient up here or in here, but they actually have the potential. So there's I don't think, and this is not my area of expertise, but one of my mentors had said she tested a lot of soils, and even the poorest soils and the most arid, sandy deserts have more than enough nutrient to grow corn after corn after corn after corn. It's just about unlocking it. And the organic matter is how we unlock it. And this chelation is, technically it's basically making it more bioavailable and less biotoxic. Whoops. I can't talk. Plants, microbes, all life. And so a lot of times mixing it with organic matter and then this is where the science, I don't know the science of chelation, but basically the idea is mix your minerals with organic matter. Now in the foliar feeds, I just happened to meet these doctors who were like PhDs, and they worked for a cancer research institute, and I met them 10 years ago or more, and they developed a product, and people have tried to reverse engineer it. It definitely has some humates in it, but they say it's made from fermented plants, and all I know is I've used it on thousands and thousands of acres, especially when I'm trying to transition land from heavy salts or chemicals. Sometimes if you live near the coast, you might get salt in your soils, right, Alexis? Like you guys might have the salination, or if you have heavy salts from herbicides, it's really great for that. And it itself feeds fungi and protozoa, it feeds all sorts of microbes. They chew it up, and it also makes all 90-some minerals available. So, they used to think that there were 12 minerals, and then there were 30-some, and now there's 92 or something, but they're all related. This is a mineral interrelationship chart, and you don't have to memorize it, but it's like they're all interrelated, right? I don't personally want it, Jessica and I really resonate with that. We're more about the production side, and sometimes when you're limited, you have to learn a little science, but then once you learn that principle, you don't have to know all the details of the science, and as I said before, our science, we're just beginning to learn what's really going on. So basically, this Soilplex does something. If you put it on the soil, it immediately makes all your soil minerals more available. And you have to get it in the soil, at least 90 plus minerals, as long as there's water and growing. Like if you're in a drought and you put it in the soil, it just sits there and waits. Like nothing's there to chew it up, nothing's really active. And then it basically feeds all the groups of biology, but it really starts to increase your fungal component and your protozoa, which are your nutrient cyclers. We don't have to go into that, but they're the ones that start giving the plant nutrient. And so the fungi get it from the rocks and the sand, silt, and clay and the organic matter. And then when they're not eaten by protozoa, but when they're eaten by other things, or when the bacteria are eaten by protozoa, the protozoa are like pooping out plant food, basically. So it's not that the bacteria and fungi just get mineral and they go, oh, here, plant, give it to you. It's actually that they're getting it, and they're better than the plants at getting it, and they grow in numbers. And then their predators come in and eat them, and when they poop or urinate waste, that's when the plant gets a soluble nutrient. So it's not like an altruism. It's more of the plant figured out to grow this whole party around it, and the byproducts of the party are its new minerals. So in the Soilplex, what we're going to talk about today is the foliar feeding. So you can just mix the Soilplex with water, put it on the soil, but you can mix Soilplex with water, and then you can take Epsom salts for magnesium. If you need sulfur and magnesium, it's magnesium sulfate. You could take borax for boron, but very tiny amounts. I'm talking about a 1/4 pound per acre. So it makes your minerals much more less toxic because you're using less of them, less expensive, less mined inputs that you need. And so one day I'm going to figure out how to make Soluplex, but I haven't figured it out yet. But until then, it's about a gallon an acre of the stuff. So it's just a tiny bit. And you can use too much of it, right? It's too much of a good thing is too much. But basically we can make a mineral chelate. And what we do is we take water and Soluplex and then we dissolve the mineral in it by stirring. And if you believe in energy vortexes, you can, get all into putting all the love into the stirring. Sometimes some minerals that are more rocks, they're really, really hard to stir and they don't dissolve easily. But the Soluplex makes them dissolve. So if you just put the rocks with mineral, like Epsom salts will dissolve in water, and you can spray that on the plant, but it's not chelated, so it's more likely to burn the plant. So rock phosphate, you can put it in water and it's not going to dissolve very quickly. Like a little bit of it might, but when you add the Soluplex, it does. Now some of it takes a lot of stirring, and so I'll show you. We have a little paint mixer that goes on a drill, and you can still do the vortex pattern with it. It's just like it's going around 10 times for your one. Or we put it in our brewer with some rocks. So we put the Soluplex and water in the brewer. And we also started incorporating the minerals into our compost heapers. So when we're brewing microbes, we found that the microbes grow better when they have rocks and Soluplex in them. So even if you don't have a brewer, you can just put minerals and water and then spray it on your plants. And so it's just about knowing how much of each thing. Now I've dealt a lot with potassium and boron and magnesium. And I have magnesium chloride, which is Dead Sea salt. But it's from Israel, right? Like who... It's mined. And then magnesium sulfate is mined also, Epsom salts. So, but if you can use a 1/4 pound an acre versus, I don't know what Dan really recommends, but as far as these mineralization recipes on the soil, it can be a lot cheaper. And it can be, something that you can do with just a small bucket of stuff instead of having to have dump trucks and spreader trucks and all this equipment, So it's a great complementary tool. And again, it's not the foundational principles. It's not the cover crops. This is the ivy, right? So it's not something you always want to do or you may not want to do at all. But it is something to know that you can do and know about this chelator, Soluplex. And I really haven't found another product. There's a lot of products out there. But when I've talked to a lot of people like Midwest Bioag, Gary Zimmer, they don't have a product that really does this. And so they're very interested in it. And so maybe something, and that's where I'm trying to find out about some of the newer products that are coming out. This has been around for at least 15 years. But basically, there's an organically certified version and there's a non-organic version that's like a couple dollars cheaper because they use a potassium preservative. And this is for like people that have thousands and thousands of acres. A couple of dollars an acre cheaper, it makes a big difference. But he's saying that the preservative, it really has no harmful effects and it doesn't hurt the microbes and it's it's just not certified organic. So basically it digests the minerals and they bond to the Soluplex and then they don't tie up. So one of the advantages to either putting it in the soil with the minerals, putting it in the brews with the minerals, or putting it in the foliage with the minerals, or putting it on the seed with the minerals is that the minerals bind to the Soluplex, but it's a weaker bind than they would be in the soil. So it's more easily ripped off by the microbes. So that's why they choose it instead of the soil, is it's a much more freely available food. It's like if someone had food out ready, would you choose that, or would you say, no, I'm going to go out and harvest my food over here? Now, maybe if it was McDonald's and you didn't want McDonald's and you wanted to go out in your garden, you would harvest, but you do more work. But so it's basically easier for them to digest. And it has the Soluplex has a small enough particle size to get into the leaf. So normally a humic acid is such a large particle, it can't fit through the leaf. And it's also such a large particle that it over time improves your soil, but in the short run can tie up nutrients. So it has fulvic acids, and we looked at it under the microscope, and has, all sorts of different types of. So I'll just, basically that's about the conclusion of this foliar feed. And what I can do is list the products that I use that I know of, and if you guys know that your soil or plants are deficient in something, then I can find, how many pounds an acre. But let's say a lot of times plants we'll go through some major minerals, but if they need potassium, I will use different things at different times. Now this was something that I was taught a rule by someone, Elaine Ingham, a biologist, and I was like, sometimes we take on things and they become blinders, and it was only through having to do it and actually using my microscope and seeing that with the Soluplex, it didn't kill the fungi, but potassium sulfate is an organically certified source of potassium. And depending on whether you need sulfur or not, it can also be a source of sulfur. Now, if you just put potassium sulfate out as an organic fertilizer, the sulfate would kill your good fungi. And so I was brewing fungi, and I needed to feed my soybeans potassium, and I was really worried about after the brew was ready. I had documented all these fungi, and I didn't want to kill them, so I put the Soluplex with the potassium sulfate. I didn't know what was going to happen, and I poured it in the same tank, and I watched it over a period of hours, because it takes hours sometimes to spray out thousands of gallons of stuff, and it didn't kill the fungi. They were still continuing to grow, so that's all the evidence I have that it didn't kill the fungi, and the soil test said it didn't kill the fungi, but I think that was because of that chelation. If I'd have just poured potassium sulfate in my tank, probably would have been a fungicide. So there's another source of potassium. Is it green sand?
Green sand has potassium.
Yeah, so
ashes. Use ashes at all?
yeah, that's great.
Riverville has all those ashes on it.
Yep, your wood stove ashes or this wood ash,
Yeah.
not coal ash. You don't want, not fly ash. Although, I think that every product can be remediated, and so, but green sand is mined. It's a granular product. And so if I need phosphorus, rock phosphate, and again, that's mined.
Have you used green sand in the boiler? What do you call it? The
Brewer.
So this is a little more, so I'm kind of giving you the overview. There's details.
Yeah.
I have used rock phosphate in the brewer. I've used humates, which are a great source of 90-some different minerals. Humates. I'm just going to write them at the top because they're kind of like nature's compost, So they can be a source of a lot of trace minerals that aren't even, discovered yet. And so you could use green sand probably in the brewer. Again, when you say brewer, there's a whole 3-day workshop I teach because you can make a microbial extract, which you're not waking them up. It's not going to stick to your leaves. It's not going to kill a fungal disease, but you could put it on the soil. You can make a compost tea, actively aerobic, or I can just use my brewer to make a mineral chelate, which is like just minerals and water, no microbes. So the Soluplex doesn't have microbes in it. It feeds them whatever's out there, but it doesn't have a source of microbes. So, boron. So let me just give the pounds per acre. So generally, I would do 4 pounds per acre. I mean, this is a general rule, right? Just to give you an idea of how little mineral it takes, how efficient this Soluplex is. Rock phosphate around 4. But if you get into some of the trace minerals or minor minerals like magnesium or boron, so anything with a sulfate as a source of sulfur, I'm trying to think.
Manganese.
Yeah, I think it's manganese.
So some of these I've never done mineral chelations of. Like, I don't think I've ever bought something for manganese, but I'd have to think about what product you could use with the
That's
soil.
in manganese sulfate.
Yeah, pretty much any of the things that Dan lists that you can apply to the soil, it would just be figuring out how many pounds per acre would you put on the soil. And so with these, I'm pretty much doing about a 1/4 pound per acre. So now, borax, you can buy it in the store. You can use magnesium sulfate, SO4 I think, or Epsom salt. Something readily available. Or magnesium chloride. I don't know the symbol for it, but it's like Dead Sea salt. Is that the only place they mine dead magnesium chloride?
to my knowledge right now. I'm sure there's other places.
Sulfur, any sulfate. So if you need sulfur and you're using something else, then you wouldn't add any.
There's also elemental sulfur.
Yeah. So I think that it would work with almost any product. I just haven't done it, and so if you are interested in doing something, I have a mentor who knows way more about this than me, and I can ask him.
And then how about calcium? You know, everyone talks about calcium makes strong plants and stuff.
Yeah. So the other thing is with potassium, we actually have a fermented kelp or kelp. They call it kelp zyme. Or there's soluble kelps now. For calcium, I think that any kind of bone or any kind of calcium source that you would use for calcium, like gypsum.
But don't they use bone for phosphate?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing is that every cell has every element, right?
Yeah. Right.
So when you look at, except some of these chemical fertilizers, they've actually really gotten down to only a few, but even then I really think that they would have other, like in the chemistry they tell you that it's this percent nitrogen or this percent, like even if you, so nitrogen I use, that's a good one, I usually use fish hydrolysate. There is fish emulsion. Put that on.
I'll just go back to sulfur. I was thinking of gypsum.
I think you could do a gypsum. I've never done it.
Yeah.
So fish hydrolysate is a fungal food because it has more of the bones and oils. It has more of the fish, and the fish emulsion I think the bones have been removed or the fats on the skin, you know, and so it's more of a bacterial food.
What I heard is that the emulsion is like heat treated, so the particles are finer. So that's
smaller
why
particles.
it's for bacteria, yeah.
Do you know, I know Neptune's has a lot of different fishes, and I've tried to look at their labels to figure out, and sometimes they say and some of them don't, but I found a couple companies that, you know, and I've thought about just taking fish and
You can just
putting
make
in my
your own.
Vitamix, you know?
Yeah, you can just add some brown sugar to the blended up fish and let it ferment. That's fish hydrolysate. It's so easy.
And that's where a lot of them put like vitamin E stabilizers and things in them, but you know, I've been running out of fish sometimes to make a brew, and one time it was for that first workshop, and I was like, well, I don't know how long to ferment it, and like I just didn't want to try something that new at a workshop, but I was like, where can I get fish, you know? So river, but and of course different fish have different amounts of fats and different fatty acids, but the idea is that every cell is every element. But if you look at certain fertilizers, and I used to know some of them, but whatever you can buy, they'll say, well, it's this percent. Even if it is a potassium source, it's only a certain percent of it is potassium, right? And so you just can kind of geek out on looking at what is the thing that you want to chelate and what other elements it might have with it. Again, because this is like the last tool you'd want to use, one of the more expensive tools, you know, to foliar feed. But I wanted to show you some things outside, like that go on your garden hose that, you know, how do you calibrate this with a garden hose, right? Like, you just don't want to put too much, and you can calibrate it. So we could go into that if you want a little bit.
I'm out there, yeah.
I do have a calibration worksheet that I can copy. It's for a spray
If you
rig.
copy and email it to me, I can send it to everybody if that's easier.
Well, let's just talk through the calibration idea first, because this is a little complex, and because these things are certain percents, and these pounds per acre are like of the actual product, so it's not that many pounds of actual phosphorus, even, right? Like if rock phosphorus, I used to know, but I forgot. Do you know how much percent?
It depends on the source.
Yeah, there's different mine sites, right, and different deposits, and you know, it gets really technical. But you know, usually I err on the side of less in case, you know, you'd rather go with less, but you guys can kind of pass this around, but basically it's a little worksheet, and whatever let's say you have a backpack sprayer, or you have this hose thing, or, I mean, sometimes you just have a bucket, you know, like, I mean, you're not going to get a great foliar mist with a bucket. We also have a spray tank with this wand that you can attach to any garden hose, and you can buy the nozzle, and it does a great mist, you know, and so I can show you guys all scales of applications, from bucket and garden hose to backpack sprayer, or something that would go in your truck that you could park and you can root inject trees with. I've got a root injector, or we've got a spray wand, and you can mist up to like 70 feet, you know, in the air, or you can sit there and mist, you know, it gives a nice fine mist for it to hit the leaves. So we've actually, I have some pictures if anybody's interested, but I have done this in the middle of a soybean crop where we know the soil was, our soil test on this one farm tested 250 to 300 pounds low in potassium. And I basically fed the soybeans. I was doing compost teas, and I was doing cover crops and some compost, but I fed them no potassium until I saw them germinate, and I was watching, and this is what you can do, is I was watching, and somewhere around in here, they started looking a little yellow, and maybe a couple grasshoppers on them, and I started testing, and sure enough, potassium was dropping, because here, in my first true leaf or second true leaf, the potassium level was okay, because the plant didn't need that much, and it had what it needed. But as it started demanding more of the soil, the microbes weren't all the way set up yet, and so the potassium level in the leaf started dropping. And so we made this mineral chelate, put it out through the leaf, and then we documented the potassium being good. We had good yield. Some of the fields yielded up to 80 bushel soybean, which is very good yield on soybean. Some of them were more around 50, but we basically made more yield than we had the year before, not doing the mineral chelate. So I've actually seen it work in that, seen the plants come alive with it. It should work within like days, you know, you see a difference. So
Did you use potassium sulfate?
That was the time that I did. Yeah. And I did put that out with a compost tea, which had good microbes. So I was measuring the biology of the leaf and the chemistry of the leaf, the chemistry of the soil, the biology of the soil. I was really like doing a lot of research on this. So
actually, do you think we could go ahead and go
Yeah,
ahead
go
and start
outside.
seeing how to make this stuff?
yeah, I think I could go on and on. Like, if anybody wants to talk specifics, I do teach a workshop that just happened, but I will repeat it in the fall, and we did film it, because it's a lot of specifics to learn. But I think that, you know, anything that's a trace mineral, I would go with this quarter pound, and anything that's a major mineral, or maybe, you know, even calcium, you could use a little heavier. And I think it's like cooking. Sometimes you can get really precise with it and take a lot of time, or you can get something done and get feedback from the plants. You know, it's really up to you whether you want to be really mathematical about it, or you want to just kind of put a little in the tank, dissolve it, put it out with love, and see what happens, and not know exactly how many pounds you put out. So what you don't want to do is put, you know, 20 pounds an acre out, right, through the leaf. And one more thing I do want to say is that soil that was really low in potassium, very, very shut down, the plant can only uptake a certain amount through the leaf. So you might find that it works, but then in another 3 weeks, the plant's looking poor again. So the nice thing about putting the Soluplex on the soil is it lasts for about 3 months, and then it's pretty much, whenever the microbes eat it up, it's gone. So the faster the microbial growth, it could be a little less, or it could last as much as 6 months, depends on moisture, temperature again. But what I've seen sometimes is when I do put the Soluplex on the soil or in the leaf, sometimes in 3 or 6 months, it's just not completely fixed, you know? And so you might be having to set yourself up, and you have to just see how your system responds. You might need another spray. But if you're already spraying anyway, something like orchards, they spray all the time, or you have irrigation, it's something that could go out in your irrigation. You know, you can get a little mixer tank, you know. So there's ways, every system is different, whether you're going over land with a truck, whether you've got a bucket, whether you've got irrigation or some kind of pivot sprinkler system, and how I would engineer getting it out would be different. But you want to get those leaves coated, and the idea of the calibration is that you figure out, because it goes out with water, you figure out a length and a width, or some representation of a portion of an acre, and then it's the speed that you're going across it, and you figure, then you time that your backpack sprayer, if it's 30, let's say you take a tenth of an acre, and you figure out, what would be the length. You measure the width of your sprayer. Say my backpack sprayer space, 2 feet wide, and then you figure out how many feet long would be a tenth of an acre, and then or 1/28. I think this is a 1/128 of an acre because this is liquid because there's 128 ounces in a gallon. So when you come out at the end of this formula, you actually get how many gallons an acre you're putting out of total output. So you have to know your total output of your sprayer first, and then you can decide how much of the product to mix in. So you have to know a gallons an acre total output. And that's going to depend on your speed, right? And so if you're in a truck or tractor, you kind of estimate, or your lawnmower with a tank on it or whatever it is going by your bushes, you kind of have to know how fast you're going to be driving or how fast you're going to be walking. So I don't think, looking at your faces, anyone in here is going to calibrate. He's got a little ear infection. So if you want to calibrate, what we could do is when you're ready to do it, I can walk you through it, because probably if I teach it right now, you're not going to remember it or even use it ever. So do you guys have any questions before we go outside about foliar feeding?
Now, you put humates on the leaf, is that these humates, they all come in kinds. There's one that you can buy in town at the fifth season that's, I think it's like a biochar with humates in it, or they come in so many styles.
And you put it on the soil.
Yeah.
Yeah, humates are better on the soil, or with the Soilplex, I can digest them into a liquid form, chelate them. Whereas if you just put the humates in water's not going to digest them very easily. The Soilplex has a little bit of an acidic effect. It's not terribly acidic, like it doesn't burn plants even, but it does digest rocks. And so, anyway, there's all sorts of things we can talk about. But basically, that's where I put the Soilplex with the humates. And there would be something like a rock that you would need to put in a brewer, or really, really stir, or leave overnight, sitting with the water and Soilplex, and stir it in the morning, let it have some time. And then you're still going to end up with a little bit of rock in the bottom. You're just going to have to pour it through a bag or a sieve, or if you're putting it in a spray rig. So you can keep working on those humates. Those humates or that rock phosphate can last you several chelates. You can just keep digesting them until they're gone. So that's how to unlock that thing faster than, and help your microbes and your plants in the short run.